This particular presentation, I wrote an article for the Dixon Living magazine summer of 2023, a year ago, and the whole thing is published in there. So if you want to know some of the content of what you're going to see tonight, it's all in here. I pulled this out because Rusty Schrader, who is the editor of this magazine, thought of a great way to promote the article. He wrote just a little sentence here, just as a little promo for the thing. It goes like this. He grew up in Dixon, went to Eureka College, worked at a radio station, played in Hollywood movies, and was elected president on more than one occasion. And it's not who you think it is. He's talking about Moon Reagan, as all those things are also true of Moon Reagan. Obviously, he wasn't president of the United States, but he was president, as we'll get into. This presentation is how Dutch helped Moon. Dutch, of course, is Ronald Reagan. That was his nickname from childhood. And Moon Reagan is his big brother, Neil Reagan, born in 1908. They called him Moon because he looked like, or Moon Mullins, a cartoon character, and they called Ronald Dutch because he looked like a little Dutchman, something like that. Those are the stories that have been passed down through the years. They were born, of course, in Tampico. This is a photo from 1912. Now here, Ronald is about a year old. He was born in 1911. And Moon was born in 1908, 2.5 years earlier. So get this in your head to begin with, that Neil is 2.5 years older than Ronald. Here's another photo from 1914, a few years later, again, still probably when they're living in Tampico. Ronald has got the little Dutchman haircut here, and big brother Neil is a little older, 1914. And finally, they come to Dixon, living in Dixon, 1920 to 1928, and Ronald really wanted to play football, as his big brother did. And this photo shows you, so that's Neil up there in the upper right-hand corner. This is 1925. Ronald Reagan this is his sophomore year at Dixon High School. And another thing to look at here in this photo is the houses along the back. You can tell that this photo was taken right over there at what we now call A.C. Bowers Field. But at that time, there was no high school standing here, but the school district did own the property here, and they used it for the athletic field as early as 1921 when A.C. Bowers came to town. But Ronald here is just a little kid. He's a sophomore, and big brother Neil is a senior that particular year at Dixon High School. They used to have they had a unique relationship, these two brothers. As Neil once said, when somebody started taking pics at me, he'd stick in, and somebody started taking pics on him, I'd stick in. I'm not accustomed to this particular language, but I am accustomed to sticking up for your brother, and this must be what he's referring to. The relationship that these two had was a lot like a lot of brothers, like me and my brothers, I think, as well. You're never too demonstrative with your emotional attachment to your brother. You mostly, formally, you hate each other and you push each other around, and they kind of had that relationship as well. They never would have admitted that they loved their brother, but they were sticking up for each other throughout their life, and this really continued for the rest of their life. I have 9 different stories to share with you tonight. I'll turn this on a little bit, because I think I may begin to lose my voice here as we get going. Test 1, there we go. All right. Sorry to use the mic, but I'm going to lose my voice. This goes for an hour. So this is the steamer trunk story. I had never heard this story, but Neil tells this story, and it's been written down a few different times, but I wanted to share this with you. The situation here is 1929. Now, 1928 is when Ronald graduated from high school, Dixon High School. 1926 is when Neil graduated. So 1929, Neil is 3 years outside of high school, and Ronald has gone directly to Eureka College, where he is a freshman from fall of 28 to the spring of 29. Now put yourself in the middle of the summer of 1929. Ronald Reagan has gone through 1 year of college, and he loves it. And he's been trying to get his big brother to join him at Eureka College. But Neil Reagan felt like he didn't need to go to college. Back then, almost nobody went to college. It was a rarity for anybody to go to college. You really didn't need to. As he once said, he says, when I graduated from high school, I was smarter than any college professor, so I saw no need for college. That's what he thought at the time. But Ronald kept pushing him, wanted him to go. But Neil kept resisting. He had a nice job at the cement plant in Dixon in cost accounting. It was an office job, pretty decent. But during the summer of 1929, Ronald set up all kinds of things for Neil so that he could go to Eureka College with him. He got him a football scholarship. He got him a job in the girls' dorm. It doesn't get any better than that. He got him into the fraternity, the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity, the Teak House. And he got him every bit of funding that he needed to go to college except for $10 a month. That's all it was going to cost Neil to go. And as a final push to Neil to go to Eureka, Ronald bought him a steamer trunk. And this is an image of a typical kind of steamer trunk back about that time. A steamer trunk is when you just throw all your belongings in it and you haul it off to college, and then you unpack when you get to your college dorm room. And so it comes down to the final day of the summer of 1929. Ronald has been pushing Neil all summer long to go to college with him that fall. It's time for Ronald to go to his sophomore semester, and he's got this steamer trunk he's presented to his brother, and his brother's just laughing it off. No, come on, I'm not going. You're wasting your time, So Neil goes to work that day when Ronald takes off and goes to Eureka. And the mom of both these boys is pretty upset with Neil. But Neil goes to work, and he goes to talk to his boss first thing in the morning when he gets to the cement plant, a guy named Mr. Kennedy. And he says, yeah, you won't believe this story. My brother, what he's been doing, he's been trying to get me to go to college, but I'm not falling for that. He got me a football scholarship. He got me into the Teak House. He got me a job. He got me about everything I need. He even got me a steamer trunk. I just thought he's just a crazy idiot. And so then Neil goes back to his office. A few minutes later, the secretary to the boss comes up to Neil's office, and he's got his paycheck in her hand. And Neil says, wait a minute, today's not payday. She says, Mr. Kennedy says, if you're not smart enough to take the good thing your brother has fixed up for you, you're not smart enough to work for him. So he's fired. He's fired. So he was forced, basically, to go to Eureka College. So he takes that long walk home from the cement plant to their house in Dixon, and he's weighing his options, and he thought, well, I might as well go. And sure enough, he goes off to Eureka, and he joins his little brother at Eureka College. And this is a photo of what Eureka College looked like back in the day. And essentially what happens here now, there's a reversal of roles. Ronald Reagan, who's 2.5 years younger than Neil, essentially becomes the big brother. He's the big sophomore on campus, and Neil is just this newbie freshman at Eureka College. And Neil once said, he said, I guess I've really never gotten over it completely. I automatically became the younger brother in this relationship. So that's the story of the steamer trunk. Now something's happening at this point. Now this is September 1929. What happens in late October of 1929? Wall Street crash, right? You don't remember this, but you remember this from your history lessons. Wall Street has the darkest day in many years. This is the Telegraph's headlines in October the 24th of 1929. Well, it turns out that it was very fortunate for Neil to go off to college. In this college environment, if you've got the tuition, you are basically insulated from the economic disaster that is going on around you. Thousands and thousands of people are losing their jobs, are losing their money that they had saved in their banks, And meanwhile, Ronald and Neil were having a great time at Eureka College. And at this time, by sophomore year, Ronald, being the gregarious guy that he is, everybody loves Ronald Reagan. He's the big man on campus. He's involved with all kinds of clubs and activities and sports. Here you see him in the center up there with that fur coat and the glasses. He's a pretty cool guy at Eureka College on the Dramatics Club here. This is a zoom-in little closer look at Ron in this particular photo. But there are some photos that have both Ron and Neil in them at Eureka College. And this is one of them. This is the Teak fraternity. And here Ronald is in the front row, you see, but there's Neil over there in the back row, or rather the second row back there. And he's, again, the little brother now, essentially, because Ronald is moving up the ranks at the Teak House, and he will eventually become the president of the fraternity. I found this article from 1932 in the Telegraph. Neil and Ronald Reagan make good. It says Neil Reagan, who is a junior at Eureka College, has been elected president of Tau Kappa Epsilon. And Moon is very popular in campus circles, and it goes on, tells all the things that he's doing. He's the editor of this, and they're both involved in that. They're very, very popular on campus. In 1932, though, remember, Reagan went there in 1928. In 1932, Reagan is starting his senior year, and Neil is starting his junior year there. This is March of 1932. So here we go to story number 2. Tithing for Moon. This is another story that Moon tells, and I don't think Ronald ever told this story to my knowledge, but I found this story within the various articles that about Neil Reagan. In October of 1932, this story hit the Telegraph. Hired for the season, Ronald Reagan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jack Reagan of this city, has accepted a position at station WOC for broadcasting all the football games for the season. This is a big opportunity. Now, in 1932, the Depression is really setting in. And Ronald has just graduated from college, and he needs a job. And this job is actually only part-time because he's just broadcasting the games. He's not on the air every day. But within time, he is promoted and gets a full-time job, not only at WOC, but at WHO, the sister station to the station that's there in the Quad Cities. Now, this is an ad I found from 1933 that shows the power of WOC, WHO throughout the state of Iowa. See this image of the state of Iowa down here? It depicts all these other radio stations, got this little signals that they have, but the boomer signal is coming out of the 50,000 watt AM station at WHO Des Moines, which had another signal coming out of WOC in Davenport in 1933. So Ron gets hired full-time at WOC WHO. He's paid $100 a month, and which is decent money in the midst of the Depression. Neil, though, has a problem. Neil is in his senior year at college, and he still needs $10 a month to be able to finish paying off his tuition. And Ronald is well aware of Neil's plight. So Ronald, who's now got this nice job and $100 a month, and he knows that Neil needs 10, he actually goes to a minister in the Quad Cities, and he says, would the good Lord consider his share as being his if I gave it to my brother to help him through school? So Ron's already done the math. He says 10% of my $100 is going to be $10 a month, which is exactly what Neil needs to finish school. And the minister wisely said, yes, the good Lord would consider that your tithe. And so sure enough, Ronald gives $10 a month out of his own salary to help his brother finish school in 1933. So that's another way that Ronald helped out his big brother, Neil. Now, story number 3, surprise audition number 1. There's actually 2 of these, but here's the first one. But first off, let's compare the careers of both Neil and Ron. So far, up to this point, a remarkable similar trajectory of these two guys. They both graduate a year apart from each other at Eureka College. They both got an economics and sociology degree. They both were president of the Teak House. They both played football there. And they were both student senate president of the entire school student body at Eureka. So they're both really well known at Eureka and highly regarded. But also, when Neil graduates from Eureka College in 1933, the Depression is at its worst. 1/4 of America is out of work. Nearly half of the U.S. banks have failed. Incomes have plummeted. The cement plant in Dixon, where Neil used to work, has closed down because of the Depression. And Neil was forced now to enter the workforce, but he has no job, and all his money is gone, and he's out of school, so what are you going to do? Ron has an idea of a way to help Big Brother Moon again. He is now getting paid even better. He's now based in Des Moines instead of Davenport, and he's got a decent job. And he's bought a car from a dealer in Illinois. And he calls up his brother Neil, who's down there in Eureka, Illinois. He says, listen, I'd like you to go pick up my car and drive it to Des Moines for me. And that way I could get my car and you could come and see the radio station and see all the stuff that's going on here. You got nothing else to do. What are you going to do? Neil says, well, okay, I'll do that. So he hops in his car and he drives. This is my pathetic attempt to show how a car would go from Eureka up to Des Moines, Iowa in 1933. You're taking back roads all the way. You know, there's no interstate highways in 1933. But he buys this 1933 brand new Nash. And this is a picture of a 1933 Nash. It's not the same one that Ronald Reagan owned, but this just to give you an idea of what Neil is driving all the way to Des Moines for his big brother, or his little brother, Ronald. While he's there, he says, let's go to the radio station, and I want to show you the studios and all this stuff. And so he's taking him through the studio, and they happens to be there on a day when they're auditioning for a new sports announcer to help out Ronald in his job at the WOC-WHO. And so they've got like 12 different guys lined up to be going in and auditioning in the studio. They'd read some script. They'd pretend they were reporting the live broadcast of a game of some kind. And Ron already knows that Neil loves sports just as much as Ronald does. He already knows also that Neil has the gift of gab just like Ronald does. So he says to Neil as they're walking through the studio, why don't you try out for this job? I can get you an audition. And Neil said, well, okay. And so Ron pokes his head into the guy who's doing all the auditions. Do you mind if my brother steps in and takes a shot at it? No, bring him in. So he brings him in, does the usual thing of reading some script as well as pretending that he's reporting a game, and he nails it. He knocks it out of the park. He gets hired on the spot. But the only problem is he's just going to get paid $30 a week. Sounds still okay to us compared to $100 a month, but he's not going to have enough to live in Des Moines or in Davenport at this time. But Ronald says to Neil, quote, look, don't worry about it. You can live in my apartment, and that won't cost you anything. We'll get by. So once again, Dutch helps Moon out of a jam and gives him a big step into his next career, this time in radio. And that direct quote is from, this is what Neil Moon Reagan said that Ronald said. So this is all going on in 1933. Meanwhile, while all that's taking place, Ronald's career as the head sports announcer in Des Moines at WOC-WHO is taking off. Here's an article from the Telegraph of 1934. Dutch Reagan winning place in the radio world. Dixon boy hailed as one of the best sports announcers in the country. He's really getting to be well known in 1934. At the same time that Ronald's career is taking off in radio, Neil runs into a woman in Des Moines and he marries her. Her name is Bessie Hoffman, as you see here in this article from the Des Moines newspaper. And he marries her in 1935 while they're both working at the radio station. But of course, we know the next big step, which changes everything for both of them, happens in 1937 when Ronald gets a film contract. And this is the article as it appeared in the Des Moines Tribune, April 3rd of 1937. It's quite interesting to read this actual article. Ronald tells the whole story about how he got out to Hollywood and he got a screen test. He was there for the Chicago Cubs to report on a game that was going on out there, but he gets this connection to go to Warner Brothers studio and get a studio audition, and he knocks it out of the park. The guy's great in front of a camera or in front of a microphone, any way you look at it, and he gets hired. It's a big deal for Ronald Reagan. This is April when this news is shared. He finally goes out there, I think maybe in June, but by September of that year, just 3 months later, he's making so much money now, he moves his parents from Dixon out to California. They're kind of struggling at this point. It's still the Depression is going on. His dad is bouncing from one job to the next. He also got a job with a government job here in Dixon for a while, but they both jump at the chance to move out to California, warm, sunny Southern California, in Hollywood or Beverly Hills, somewhere around there, and move into a new house there that Ronald has provided for them. Ron gets his first movie. It's called Love is on the Air, which is a perfect story about a guy who's been in the radio. And while I was researching for this material, I stumbled on the internet, a trailer for this movie, Love is on the Air, which features Ronald Reagan. This may be the first video of Ronald Reagan that got disseminated anywhere, even before the movie got out. So listen to this. It's just 1937 quality, so bear with me, but this is really something.
How do you do, everybody? I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ronald Reagan. A few months ago, I was a sports announcer on a radio station in Des Moines, Iowa. One day I ran into one of these movie talent scouts. I think I caught him off guard because the next thing I knew I was taking a screen test for Warner Brothers in Hollywood. I guess it was okay. At least I liked Hollywood, so here I am. They did everything they could to make me feel at home, too. The first picture, well, what do you think it was about? A radio station. Well, that's all I can tell you about the picture, except that when you see it, I hope you like it. If you have a little spare time, why, drop me a line at Warner Brothers Studios in Hollywood. I'll see you in the movies.
I think that's the coolest thing ever. I don't know. I'd never seen anything like that. That's probably the youngest video you'll ever see of Ronald Reagan, 1937. And boy, can he handle the camera. He's smiling. He's looking directly into the camera, just tossing off those lines like it's so easy. The guy's a natural. And his career then takes off. Here's an article that appeared in the Dixon Telegraph when his first picture then came to the Lee Theater in downtown Dixon. How many of you remember the Lee Theater? Come on, you remember, don't you? They sit there on First Street. Yeah. World premiere of Dixon Boys' Success here on Sunday. And the Dixon Telegraph is following Ronald Reagan's successful career in Hollywood. All his new movies, when they came out, they would premiere them here in Dixon and show them to the local folks as well. So that was story number 3 of how Neil got, or how Ronald's career took off in 1937. But story number 4 is surprise audition number 2. Surprise audition number 1 is when he got this audition to work at WOC, WHO in Des Moines. But here comes number 2. This is happening in 1939. Ronald Reagan has been out in California for a couple of years now. Neil is in Davenport, and Ronald encourages him to drive all the way to Hollywood and come see the Warner Brothers studios, see what I'm doing out here in California. Plus, I'm dating this really cute girl, and we're thinking about getting married. Her name is Jane Wyman. You got to come out and see us. Here's a photo of Ronald and Jane Wyman when they were dating before they got married. Jane Wyman, I think, is 6 years younger than Ronald Reagan at this point. She's just a 22-year-old starlet. Ronald Reagan is 28 years old at this time. And Ronald Reagan takes Neil Moon Reagan, his big brother, on a studio tour at Warner Brothers Studios. And he's, again, the same kind of deal. Hey, while you're here, they're auditioning for some parts here in a new movie that I'm going to be in. Maybe you could get a part in it. And Neil says, well, I'm here. It took me forever to get here. I might as well give it a shot. And sure enough, he gets a part in the movie. And this story appears back in the Quad City Times in January of 1940. Reagan resigns his WOC post, is moving to Los Angeles for a film career. Sound familiar? This happened to Neil as well. This photo, his first movie, is being talked about for Neil Reagan. These are some of the publicity photos they took of Neil Reagan when he first went out to Hollywood to be a big movie star. And this is the movie that he got to be in. The movie was called Tugboat Annie Sails Again. This was the poster that appeared for this particular movie. Let's zoom into some important parts of this thing. There's there's Ronald Reagan with Jane Wyman. You see their names, of course, mentioned up here at the top. They're starring in the Tugboat Annie movie. It turns out that Neil does have a part in this movie, but he's nowhere mentioned anywhere on this particular poster for the thing. Instead, he does get a few bit parts in a few movies, but it doesn't take off like Ronald's career had. And he does get, however, a job with KFWB Radio in Hollywood. WB stands for Warner Brothers. This is a Warner Brothers owned radio station. They're in Hollywood. And Neil Reagan, he's been on radio for 5 years already out there in WHO, WOC. He knows the business. He's been doing the news and doing the sports and been even, I think it was the news director, program director back there at home. But he gets a job at KFWB, brought to you by Mission Bell Soap. They had to promote all the sponsors that they had back then. This is November of 1940. So he finally gets a steady job out in California, working in radio, something that he knew. Something else also happens in 1940. In January, Ronald Reagan gets married to Jane Wyman. There's a photo of Jack Reagan, his father, over here, and Nell Reagan, his mother, right there. But I brought them up here in this photo of the picture just to show you and to talk a little bit about Jack Reagan. Now, Jack Reagan, it's 1940. He's only 56 years old, but in 1941, he died suddenly at only 56 years old at their home in Beverly Hills, California, at the home that Ronald Reagan had set up for them to live at. But he dies and leaves Nell all by herself out there in California, but Ronald's going to make sure she's well taken care of. This is a story that appeared in the Telegraph in May of 1941. Meanwhile, at the same time, while this is going on, Neil is still taking his shot at a few movies. Here's a photo I found of Neil Reagan having a bit part in another movie where he's dressed up as a Navy captain. But basically, his movie career fizzles pretty quickly. He stays in radio, but after 1944, his career really starts to take off. And that is story number 5 of our 9 stories here. I found this interesting photo from about 1944. This is during World War II. Ronald Reagan gets involved with the Army. He is producing training films. He produced over 100 training films during the war. And there's not a lot of movie activity going on during this time, but you see Ronald dressed up. I think it's a captain's uniform. And Neil was not in the service at this time. He's almost 3 years older than Ronald, so apparently I never heard an explanation of why he did not join the service at that time, but he's probably older. He was born in 1908, so in 1944 he would have been 36 years old and probably outside of the limit of whatever it was. But he gets a job with CBS, so which seems to be a nice move to go from KFWB radio to CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, and their job that they had for him out in the Hollywood area as well. But he's only with CBS for about a year before he is hired by a major advertising agency called McCann Erickson. This is the logo that they had for many, many years. And this agency still exists to this day. They are known around the world. It's one of the world's foremost advertising agencies. And at McCann Erickson, he is promoted to head of their Hollywood office. He produces and directs many of the top radio shows in the 1940s. In 1945, he becomes a renowned expert in media and advertising. Now remember, there's no television in 1944, 1945. There's just radio. Anybody who's listening to the media is hovered around the radio station like this family is here in this photo back at that time. But Neil is getting very good at producing radio shows. He knows radio. He's already been in radio for 10 years, or more than 10 years now, from his experience back in the Quad Cities as well. So that's story number 5, how his career begins to take off into the advertising industry. Story number 6. I began to notice this similar track between Neil and Ron and when their careers really took off. And it was really because of their involvement in trade associations that their career took off. Ronald got involved in the trade association known as the Screen Actors Guild, and Neil got involved in the trade association known as the Advertising Association. I'll describe that here in a minute. But Ronald Reagan, he became the SAG president. You may have heard a lot about this stuff. This has been well publicized. Ronald Reagan becomes president of the Screen Actors Guild, and it was a crucial time for this particular trade association because there were fears of communists infiltrating the movie industry, and not just fears, but there were actually documented cases where this was going on. And they haul Ronald Reagan, the president of Screen Actors Guild, in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, to go to Washington, D.C., and say, what are you doing about all these commies trying to infiltrate the film industry out there in Hollywood? Well, Ronald gets in front of them, and he has a long speech that he gives. Here's just a few seconds of that speech just to give you a flavor of what Ronald was doing, and using his expertise as a spokesman, expertise with reading a script, expertise with a microphone in front of Washington, D.C.
We have done a pretty good job in our business of keeping those people's activities curtailed. We have, after all, we must legally recognize them at the present as a political party. On that basis, we have exposed their lies when we came across them. We have been eminently successful in preventing them from their usual tactic of trying to run a majority of an organization with a well-organized minority.
It turns out Reagan's involvement in fighting the communists and their influence in the Screen Actors Guild becomes a significant foundational base for him to launch into politics later on. The Dixon Telegraph was also following his career doing this. This article appeared in the Telegraph in October of '49. Reagan leads fight against film bad guys. And he was well known around the country in speaking out against communist infiltration into the Hollywood film industry. He's speaking in various places around the country for the first time to talk about the communist threat. At the same time that all this is going on, there's trouble at home. In 1948, Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman are going to split up. They had been married at this point for 8 years. They've got a couple of kids, but the problem here, I used to think that Jane Wyman must have been the problem, right? But there's evidence that that's not entirely the case at all. run this article that appeared in the Telegraph in 1948, politics was the cause of the Reagans' divorce. As it says here, arguments over politics drove a marital wedge between Jane Wyman, age 32, and her actor husband Ronald Reagan, formerly of Dixon. She testified in obtaining a divorce in Hollywood on Monday. She said it wasn't so much that she disagreed with her husband, but that she couldn't generate the intense interest he showed in politics and in the Screen Actors Guild, of which he is president. And Ronald Reagan himself, in his own biography, which he wrote several years later, he said this statement. He said, "Perhaps I should have let someone else save the world and save my own home." It was a real blow to him to get a divorce. Very few people got divorces back then, even though Hollywood got to be more known for that kind of activity. But he's from Dixon. He's from Jack and Nell Reagan. He's from the First Christian Church in Dixon. And this is a severe blow to Ronald Reagan to have to suffer this particular problem. Now, I want to show you a little clip from when Ronald Reagan was here in Dixon in 1984. But I want you to keep your mind in 1949, when Ronald Reagan is split up. He is estranged from his wife and kids. He's all alone, and he is shooting a movie in England. And he's going to tell the story on the stage at the Dixon High School Lancaster Gymnasium in February of 1984. Listen.
Thank you for those very generous words. And I can't help but digress, being bathed in nostalgia as I am. That line back there that you just read, actually, I have to tell you how that came about. I was in England making a picture called The Hasty Heart. It was a story in which we were all in a field hospital in Burma, India in World War II, and talking about things like home. And the line in the script was a famous Broadway play had me saying that everybody has a place to go back to, and for me it's Boston. Well, after almost 4 months of an English winter, I was so homesick. Now, the funny thing is, I'd lived a great many years away from Dixon by that time, in California. But I found myself saying to the director, I would like to change the line. And I changed the line. Dixon, place on the Rock River.
I included all the cheers there. I remember that moment when he made that statement. I changed the line to Dixon. I still get tingles, goosebumps when I hear that, because it electrified that audience like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Just the feeling, the coming home. Here we have the President of the United States talking about Dixon being that place he comes home to, that place that he calls home. And that was 1949 when this happens now, when he's gone up there in England, he's estranged from his wife, he's all by himself. And that time, while he's working with the Screen Actors Guild at this time, Neil is working with the Advertising Association. He gets elected president of the Hollywood Advertising Club in 1951. Later on that same year, he is elected president of the Advertising Association of the West in an election in Denver, Colorado. And he is involved with speaking up and down the West Coast, all over the place, on behalf of the Advertising Club. Advertising at this point, this is the very early 1950s. Television is starting to make its inroads into an American culture, and everybody's wanting to know, how do we utilize television for business? And just like when the internet got going back in the 90s, people were wanting to know, how are we going to monetize this thing known as the internet? Well, they're doing the same thing with television in 1951. And who's the guy who knows the most about this whole thing of radio and television? Well, Neil Reagan is right up there on the list. And it's interesting to me that while Ronald Reagan is promoting American values and fighting against communism as part of the Screen Actors Guild, Neil Reagan is also encouraging people to sell the U.S. way of life in their advertising. This article blew my mind when I found this in the internet in 1951. In 1952, I found this article of him with Governor Earl Warren of the state of California. They get Advertising Week proclaimed by the governor. That's Neil Reagan there. I think this is him right there. And that's Earl Warren, who would later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, if that name sounds familiar to you at all. So it's a big deal. Neil is getting well known throughout the country, as well as Ronald Reagan, who's being well known also in his role also. While all that's going on, remember Ronald Reagan is really lonely and he's in England, wanting a place to go back home to. He finds Nancy. And Nancy and Ronald Reagan get married on March the 4th of 1952. And for Ronald Reagan, his life will now be complete. And for the rest of his life, he'll find a good deal of happiness in his family life anyway. In 1953, Ronald Reagan, in this unique role that he had developed for himself as a spokesman for the film industry, or the Screen Actors Guild, he gets a job as a spokesman for the General Electric Theater, where now you're seeing a television show that has a spokesman, a host, not just an actor who's playing a part, but somebody who's the spokesman. And this is Ronald Reagan with the General Electric Theater that starts in 1953, goes on till 1962. He has this job for almost 10 years. And if you wonder, how many of you remember General Electric Theater? Come on, Dave, you know. Yeah, some of you do. Is it just you and me? Are we that old? I guess so. There's a little sample.
Good evening. I am Ronald Reagan speaking for General Electric. Tonight from Hollywood, it is my pleasure to appear in a story entitled The Dark, Dark Hours. Young James Dean, one of the bright new actors in Hollywood, appears with me, and Constance Ford plays my wife on the General Electric Theater.
See, this guy really knows what he's doing. He knows how to sit in front of a camera, smile, and deliver the lines so effectively. And he was a real star. General Electric Theater was one of the top 10 shows on television throughout the 1950s. He becomes well known nationally through the General Electric Theater. At the same time, throughout this entire period of the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, Neil and Moon Reagan and Dutch Reagan are getting together every Christmas and every Thanksgiving, just like you may have done with your family. They would get together there in California and celebrate the holidays together. So they know each other quite well. They're seeing each other on a regular basis. They both live in California. They know each other well. Which brings us to story number 7, the Goldwater account. 1964, we just got done with a presidential election. 60 years earlier, the presidential election of 1964 was between Barry Goldwater and who? Lyndon Johnson, there you go. Now, Jason, you would know this, come on. LBJ is the Democratic candidate, and Barry Goldwater is the Republican candidate. And Ronald Reagan, who's getting well known in political circles here, is also well known to Barry Goldwater and is even traveling with him and speaking for him at various places and times. And Ronald sees the ads that had been put together for Barry Goldwater, and he says, Barry, these ads are pathetic. My brother can do a much better job. He's been in advertising and media for 30 years now. He's with McCann Erickson, one of the world's largest agencies, and I don't think it's too late, but you need to drop your current ad agency provider and get a new one, and you should go to Neil. And he does it. Ronald Reagan gets Neil Reagan this big job for McCann Erickson running the advertising for the Goldwater campaign late in the campaign. Now, you might remember this famous speech that Ronald Reagan delivered as part of the Goldwater campaign. This is October the 26th, about a week before the election of 1964, in a last-ditch effort to try to save the Goldwater campaign. The speech is called A Time for Choosing. This is just a little excerpt from that to give you an idea of what it sounded like.
If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. Thank you very much.
Basically, it launches an entirely new career for Ronald Reagan. He electrified that audience there at the last week of October of 1964. People now realize that Reagan, in this nationally televised speech, he is something to be keeping your eyes on. His speech, called "A Time for Choosing," is published throughout the country. People were amazed at this thing. This is the Telegraph on October the 31st of 1960, publishing every word of Reagan's speech. And they weren't the only one to do so. I found ads in newspapers all over the country as they rebroadcast Reagan's famous speech. This is, where is this? WMTW-TV, Channel 8 in Portland, Maine. Here's another ad from the other side of the country, Salem, Oregon. "A Time for Choosing," Ronald Reagan speaking to America on behalf of Goldwater. That would be repeated at 9 p.m. on Sunday. And there's another ad. Where's this one from? This is from the Indianapolis News. So all over the country, people are rebroadcasting Reagan's famous speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater. But as we know, it was way too little, way too late, that Goldwater was trounced in the election of 1964 by LBJ. So that's story number 7. Now, yes, Neil got the advertising job, but it was too little and too late, and it just wasn't going to fly. So story number 8. Here's where the tables turn. So far, we've been reading how Dutch helped Big Brother Moon, but now we're going to see where Moon is going to be helping out Dutch in the 1960s. Here's what was going on. I don't know if some of you remember this show, Death Valley Days, which was popular on TV from 1952 all the way to 1964. Its host was a guy named Stanley Andrews, this guy here. But in 1964, he's getting too old. He's starting to flub his lines. He's starting to be unreliable at work. And who's the producer of Death Valley Days? Neil Reagan is the producer of Death Valley Days, a television show. So Neil needs a new host for Death Valley Days, one of the nation's top television shows at the time. So he goes to who? Who's better at doing this other than Ronald Reagan, right? He's well known throughout the country for the General Electric Theater. He just got nationally known in 1964 for this speech that he gave for the Goldwater campaign, but he's not run for any office at this point at all. And so he says to Ronald, listen, you're not working anywhere right now. Your movie career has dried up. All the money you made off the General Electric Theater is gone. Listen, I got a job for you. You could be the host of Death Valley Days and keep your face out in front of the public here. And Neil sets up this interesting Brown Derby luncheon date. Ronald has turned him down about being the host of Death Valley Days. But Neil knows how to get Ronald's attention. Neil talks to Ronald's agent and says, listen, you got to talk to him and sell this idea of Death Valley Days to him. And so, in this luncheon meeting at the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood, California, the agent meets with Ronald Reagan while Neil is elsewhere in the restaurant. And sure enough, the agent sells Ronald, and he agrees to do it, and then he sees Moon over there in the other corner, and then they smile and have a good laugh with each other, that he finally accepted Moon's help in getting Ronald a job as Death Valley Days. And sure enough, he becomes the new spokesman for Death Valley Days for the next 2 years, which was a big help to Ronald's future political career, which brings us to story number 9, where Moon helps Dutch again. He admitted with this Death Valley Days thing this statement: there was a little method in my madness about Death Valley Days. It kept Ronald in the public eye for what I figured might be helpful if he ran for governor of the state of California. But there was a big uphill climb in running for governor of California in 1966. The opponent was going to be the sitting governor, who was Edmund Brown. He's a very popular 2-term governor in California. He was so popular that the last time he ran in 1962, he ran against Richard Milhouse Nixon, who had been vice president of the United States from 1952 to 1960, serving with President Eisenhower. But this guy even beat Nixon. And he was also being considered as a vice presidential running mate for LBJ in 1964. He's that popular when he wants to run for re-election in 1966. So Reagan is up against a major uphill climb. Plus, on the downside, he had this against him: Bedtime for Bonzo, which was just a fine movie. This is a regular comedy movie, but yes, Edmund Brown, Pat Brown, used this against Reagan, said he's just a Hollywood actor. All he knows about is sleeping with monkeys and Bedtime for Bonzo. And by the way, they continued to use that Bedtime for Bonzo criticism against Reagan when he ran for president many years later. I remember that much. But so, while Reagan has this huge uphill battle in fighting against Edmund Brown, enter Neil Reagan into the picture. Neil Reagan handles the advertising for the Reagan campaign. He is vice president at McCann Erickson by this time. He's got 30 years of media experience. He knows the power of advertising and how to use it for the best possible way at that time. But he made this interesting statement I ran across. I did not know this until I found this statement by Neil Reagan. He said, speaking about Ronald, there isn't a better communicator in the business. He has a photographic mind. He never took a script home to memorize the lines. I had never heard that about Ronald Reagan. Maybe you had, but I hadn't. He was that good. And Neil said, he went on to say in the same interview, he said, I just need to get my brother in front of a camera. He knows how to deal with a camera. He relates to people. Get him in front of real people in real situations. He's just great with real people. He's warm. He's personable. He smiles. People love him instantly. So get him out in front of people. And sure enough, it works. The Neil strategy gets Ronald Reagan elected governor of California by a landslide. He sweeps 56 out of the 59 counties throughout the state of California. The next year, Neil Reagan is named Man of the Year by the Western States Advertising Agencies Association. He is also promoted to senior vice president at McCann Erickson. So even the company he's working for recognizes the powerful role that he had with Reagan, as well as in all the other work that he's been doing with Death Valley Days and radio shows for years and years and years. But that word and the prominence of the reputation of these two individuals, Ronald and Neil Reagan, also gets back to the Midwest. In 1970, Eureka College is building a brand new building on its campus, and it names the new building for the Reagans, and that building is still there to this day. This is an article that appeared in the Telegraph in March of 1970. In that article and in that dedication of the building, which the two Reagans went back to Eureka to go be there for the dedication, they made this statement: "These two boys have maintained high standards of character and ethics in their dealings with both friends and opponents." And that was indeed a commonality between Neil Reagan and Ronald Reagan throughout their life. They just had excellent standards of character and ethics in their dealings with everyone, and that's why they did so well in their careers. Reagan then runs for re-election in 1970. He wins handily again in 1970 as he wins a second term as governor of the state of California. Now, by 1973, Neil is 65 years old, and he's ready to hang it up. And he does. He retires at age 65 in 1973. Now, Ronald Reagan hasn't run for president yet, right? But Neil is retired, and he's not going to help anymore. But as we all know, Ronald Reagan did run for president in 1980. He wins by a landslide, carries 43 states in a huge election for the Republicans in 1980. In 1981, Ronald Reagan is even named Man of the Year. Of course, you remember the assassination attempt in March of 1981. He becomes almost mythically famous at that point. 1984, we could talk for an hour about the Reagan presidency, but I'm not going to do that. Just hit some highlights here. 1984, February 6th, Ronald and Neil Reagan come back to Dixon right here. They go to the Reagan home. That's where that picture was taken. They come, that freezing cold parade in February of 1984. Some places it was below zero, and they're trying to have blowing trumpets in a parade in downtown and First Street, Dixon. This is a little bit of a piece of video from that parade in downtown Dixon. There's no audio with this, which is probably just as well. I understand the guys who were trying to play the trumpets, they couldn't get the things to work because it was frozen. But there you see Chuck Percy, Senator Charles Percy, who was to the left of Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan then to his left, to Reagan's left, and then Neil Moon Reagan is on the far right there of the four people. I think this is the future farmers of America freezing their butts off as they walk down First Street in downtown Dixon. Of course, these guys have got gloves on, and that's just a bit of what was going on. Were any of you at that parade? Were you at the parade? Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. There were protests going on at the courthouse. I knew you would do it, Dave. But yeah, it was a big day for Dixon throughout all the city. Everybody remembers that. 1984, he does run for re-election, and he wins again handily. When there's this inauguration photo taken in the White House, you see Neil Moon Reagan standing right there with his wife Bessie, and there's, of course, Ronald Reagan and his family in the rest of the photo. Advancing quickly up to 1996, Neil Reagan dies at age 88. It's interesting, this story from, the San Bernardino Times says, Neil Reagan, a one-time announcer at KFWB radio in Los Angeles, he died at 80. I think his career was a whole lot more significant than being a one-time radio announcer at KFWB. He had become a nationally known media expert in advertising, but he dies in 1996. So if you look back on the life of Neil and Ronald Reagan, these two boys, born in Tampico, they grow up together there. They go on to Dixon High School. They both played football together at Dixon. They went on to Eureka College together. You remember the story? They played football together there and were in the teak house together. They both went on then to get a radio career at the Quad Cities, and then on to Hollywood, where they both became well known in the Hollywood and advertising and media culture there. They both then reunited back at Dixon in 1984 at the Reagan home. Neil Reagan was then laid to rest. He is buried not in Dixon, not in California. He is buried in Des Moines, Iowa, at the Hoffman family plot, there where his wife, Bessie, she would go on to live to be, what does that say, 102 years old before she died. They were childless. They had no kids. And Ronald Reagan, who by then is dealing with, by the time that Neil died in 1996, Reagan's already got Alzheimer's setting in, his memory's starting to go, but he issues a statement when Neil dies, and he says at that time, we will miss him terribly. So the two brothers grew up together here in Dixon and in Tampico, knew each other and helped each other out, sticking up for each other throughout their careers and lives together and all the obstacles they faced. And that is my story of how Dutch helped Moon. It's just been us kids here. I appreciate you listening. Hope you enjoyed this.